Section 1 of Dad's Trip to Brisbane. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Son of the Exiles. Dad's Trip to Brisbane by Steele Rudd. Section 1. How Dad Fell Out with Daly. Daly had been to Brisbane and returned bursting with enthusiasm and information. He called at Ruddville to unburden himself to Dad. Daly was a welcome visitor at our place and always got on well with Dad. Besides Daly, Dad was the only man on Saddletop acquainted with the capital. Dad posed as an authority on the geography of Brisbane, knew every hole and corner of it, and could tell you exactly where Cribs and Junkaways and Toppins and Winships and old Bartley's places were. It was no credit to him, though, because he had worked there a whole month nearly 45 years ago.
"You wouldn't know it, man,"
Daly said deprecatingly.
"You'd get lost."
Dad wasn't so sure.
"Don't know,"
he said thoughtfully, stroking his long grey beard.
"Why, it's all built on for miles. Houses everywhere, and streets. You don't know where the devil you are for 'em. It's a fact."
Turning aggressively on Joe, who displayed an inclination to doubt.
"You can smile."
Then to Dad.
"And people, by gad."
Daly couldn't convey any idea of the population. Language failed him. Sarah instanced the crowd that attended old Mrs. Delaney's funeral by way of comparison.
"Be damned."
Daly was not a polite man.
"Pshaw, nothing. You've seen big mobs of sheep, haven't you?"
All of us had.
"Well, there's simply nothing to the crowds you see on the main street on a Saturday night. So help me goodness."
Addressing Mother, his mouth, eyes and hands all working.
"I never thought there were so many people in the world, Mrs. Rudd."
Dad reflected.
"Must go down when the wheat's in and see it again,"
he said.
"If you do,"
Daly went on,
"stay at Mrs. O'Reilly's in Roma Street. Best place in the whole town, and only 13 bob a week. Tip-top table, and 2 all right girls waits on you. Looks after you as if you're a duke, no mistake, and look here," turning excitedly to Mother, "polish your boots every bloomin' mornin' and—"
Daly paused to cough.
"And fetch tea into the bed, do you?"
All of us laughed except Sarah. She turned up her nose and went out. Sarah was a Sunday school teacher now. "Hey, the girls!" Joe shouted above the noise.
"Of course."
"Go on with you," Mother said, looking on the floor. She didn't believe Daly.
"My colonial,"
Daly said. "Here's the place for us, David, when we go down," Joe put in, poking Dave hard in the ribs. Dave grinned his long, slow grin.
"You go to Riley's,"
Daly continued, addressing Dad again.
"Ask for—" "There were a place,"
Dad mused, interrupting Daly,
"on the crick, where I used to stay near—" "Crick!" Daly guffawed. "Crick! There isn't any crick. Damn me, I tell you, it's all built on, man. All houses, miles and miles of 'em. The river's what you mean."
And he laughed cheerfully.
"Nonsense,"
Dad said, turning red in the face.
"There's a crick as well. Mulcahy's place is on the bank. Did you see Mulcahy's place?"
Tears ran down Daly's eyes.
"What part of Brisbane do you mean?"
he asked of Dad in a voice that implied ridicule.
"Confound it, fellow!"
Dad broke out.
"Do you think I've never been there?"
"Now don't get angry over it," Mother imposed in her quiet, kind way. But Dad would never suffer a contradiction.
"Here,"
he shouted, violently displacing a portion of the tablecloth and brandishing his pocket-knife.
"Here's Brisbane, ain't it?"
He savagely scratched a tracing, something like a square, on the table, which annoyed Mother. Daly smiled, and when Dad glared round at him, nodded assent.
"There's the river,"
raking the knife through the square and making Mother jump. Daly, watching closely over Dad's shoulder, chuckled acquiescence.
"And that there's the bridge?"
Gashing the river in two.
"Correct."
Daly said, grinning more.
"Here's Windmill Hill. Here's Rafferty's pub in South Brisbane."
Dad dug a hole in the table to mark the pub, and Mother shuddered.
"Here, just behind Rafferty's, is a ridge and a water hole where me and Andrew Rafferty got our water, and a lot of scrub running right along this way."
Hacking another channel in the cedar.
"Bah!"
Daly exclaimed in disgust.
"Water hole? Scrub? What in the devil are you talking about? Didn't I tell you the place was all houses?" "Houses be damned!"
Dad roared, showing all his teeth. He only has 3 now.
"There's no houses there."
Prodding the knife into South Brisbane.
"Here's where the houses is."
He stabbed North Brisbane hard and said angrily,
"All along here, and this running up here."
More mutilations, which pained Mother.
"Is the crick." "Pshaw! Crick! That!"
Daly struck the tracing with his fist and didn't notice he shook Sarah's flower vase off the table.
"That's all shops." "Shops!"
Dad yelled, plunging the knife into the cedar and snapping the blade.
"Are you mad? How the devil can there be shops in a crick?"
Daly turned green with rage.
"You don't know anything about it,"
he said, taking up his hat.
"You know nothing."
Mother pleaded for peace, and Joe grinned at Dave.
"Look here."
Dad roared, following Daly to the veranda.
"I was in Brisbane before you or your father or any of you ever saw the country." "You might,"
Daly sneered.
"You might, but you know damn little about it all the same."
And then he went away. End of section 1. Recording by Son of the Exiles. Section 2 of Dad's Trip to Brisbane. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Son of the Exiles. Dad's Trip to Brisbane by Steele Rudd. Section 2. The wheat was in, and Dad decided to take a trip to Brisbane. For 7 or 8 years he'd been thinking of that trip, but something or other always came to prevent his going. According to Dad himself, the farm would suffer if he went away for a month. There would be no one to look after it, no one to manage. According to us, there would be no one to look on while the cows were being milked, no one to stand in the paddock all day while the hay was being raked and carted and stacked. No one to fuss around and be a nuisance to Dave while he sold a draft of fats to a butcher or drove a profitable deal with the pig buyers. No one to yell boisterously for the whereabouts of any of us when we chanced to be concealed from view for a moment or two by a dray or a haystack or something. No one to annoy the men who worked hardest and to incite them to strike and seek employment elsewhere. No one to molest Regan's bull when it came round our way. No one to take the gun down when little Billy Berrup came to see Sarah. No one to sool the dogs onto travelling stock and challenge the big dusty drovers to get down and be obliterated. And no one to aggravate Dave and Joe to blasphemy and rebellion. Yes, we would miss Dad when he went away. Still, we encouraged him to go. We were not selfish. We said it would be a pleasant change to him. We said nothing of the pleasure it would be to ourselves. We thought only of Dad. Some families never think of their father at all. We never forgot Dad for a day. He was never out of our minds. Mother was to accompany Dad to the city, and Bill, with the buggy, was waiting at the door to take them to the train. We admired the tall hat that Sarah had bought Dad for a Christmas present.
"Don't forget now,"
Dad adjured Dave for the 100th time,
"to start chaff cutting tomorrow, and look out the milk don't be late at the factory, and see Regan sends that collar back today, and if that fella comes for pigs, have 'em all ready for him, and mind if Thompson—"
Sarah exchanged kisses with Mother and hoped she would have a good time, and sent her love to Nora.
Wants to lend her the filly, he can't get her. Damn ye, way horse!
The animal had switched its tail just when Dad placed his foot on the buggy step.
Don't forget now to...
"Won't you put your hat straight, Dad?" from Sarah.
To start chaff cutting first thing. Way, will ya? And see the men ain't loafing about all day. It'll be all right,
Dave answered. Then Bill stirred the horse up and the buggy started.
So long,
Dave said. Sarah waved her hand.
"Take care of yourselves,"
Joe called out.
"Remember me to Henry Norman and watch you don't get run in."
Dad turned his head and shouted back.
Don't leave the cows too long in the lucerne.
"Bust the cows,"
cheerfully from Joe.
Don't leave the cows too long in the lucerne.
Dad yelled again.
All right,
Dave shouted between his hands, loud enough to be heard in Parliament.
all right.
From Joe, louder even than Dave. Poor Dad, Sarah mused. The cows are a worry to him. A few turns of the wheels and the buggy stopped. Dave wondered.
"Changed his mind,"
said Joe. Sarah laughed.
And you better put 'em out now.
Dad shouted.
"For heaven's sake, get 'em out,
Joe advised.
or he won't go."
Yes, yes.
Dave bawled and packed Tom off to turn the brutes out. Then the buggy disappeared round the corner, and Dave and Joe and Sarah and the rest of us marched inside and looked round. All of us rejoiced. We had never had so much freedom at home before, and we felt would never have again. Joe pulled on an old faded smoking cap of Dad's that lay on the parlour table and declared himself king. In a voice like Dad's, he ordered Bill to
Clear out to the devil and do some work.
Bill disobeyed. Joe took him by the neck. Bill resisted, and a brilliant engagement took place on the new carpet. They tumbled and rolled about like bullocks, broke the legs off 2 chairs, and shook down from the wall an enlarged picture of Dad's father that had cost a lot of money. Sarah flew into a passion, said she wouldn't stay another hour in the house if that was the way they were going to carry on. And when the combatants fell under the table and rose with it on their backs and tilted it with a loud crash against the piano, she appealed distractedly to Dave.
Steady there now, you fellas,
Dave said.
Steady.
"It's only the pedigree,"
Joe answered, puffing hard and restoring grandfather to the shattered frame. Sarah was irate, but Tom's voice, announcing the approach of Billy Berrup, calmed and conciliated her. "He's not," she said, eagerly turning to the door. Then, changing colour, she cast an eye over her attire and fled to doll herself up. A new idea occurred to Joe.
"See me startle Berrup,"
he said, and pulling the smoker on again, he slipped away. Robing himself in a familiar old rag of Dad's, he took down the gun and hobbled forth to welcome Berrup, who, at the moment, was bending from his horse to open the gate.
To hell out of this!
Joe roared, at a range of 60 yards. Berrup looked up and saw the gun. He didn't wait for anything more. He didn't wait to open the gate again either. He spurred his horse and galloped down the headland. Joe fired the weapon off and yelled as Dad several times had yelled before. Berrup made a wide circuit through the stubble, doubled back on Joe, reached the gate at racing speed, and while we wildly rejoiced from the verandah, disappeared down the lane and was lost in dust. "You're nothing but an ass," Sarah said when Joe returned. "You're a fool. I'll let Dad know your carryings on when he comes back." Then we went cheerfully to work. End of section 2. Recording by Son of the Exiles. Section 3 of Dad's Trip to Brisbane. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Son of the Exiles. Dad's Trip to Brisbane by Steele Rudd. Section 3. The Great Metropolis. Dad and Mother arrived in Brisbane at dusk and alighted at the Central Railway Station. Dad took his bag and, with Mother laden with parcels, went to seek lodgings. They were welcome to a boarding house on Wickham Terrace that Nora had recommended to them. A daughter of the woman who kept it taught in Kangaroo Point School with Nora. 'Twas a large house and a lively place to stay at. 12 boarders in it, 12 gentlemen boarders of different degrees and dress and dispositions. One was born with a gift for music and had the patience and courage to develop it. He used to spend his nights thumping "Alice, where art thou?" out of the piano. Another constantly mortified the landlady and made her miserable and unhappy. He would stay in on evenings she had company, reading the newspaper, and when the room was silent would straighten himself up and read aloud the house advertisements, dwelling on the comforts and accommodation with emphasis that made it sound like an indictment for perjury. And there was a luxurious lodger who always had a ball or something to go to, and used to return late in the night or at early mornings in a cab, and fly up the stairs pursued by the cabman. The others were harmless, quiet-living fellows who only growled about their shirts every week and gave notice to leave. Sweeney, a cheerful red-haired lodger coming from the bath, discovered Dad and Mother mooching about the balcony. He didn't say good morning to them or anything. He stared with all his eyes and darted into a room as if they alarmed him. Then he and 3 of the quite harmless boarders poked their heads through a half-open door and grinned and grimaced at Dad and Mother. But Dad didn't notice them, nor did he notice that they stole into the room of Doonan, the nasty member of the house. Doonan, who had lost a lot of sleep, was angry. In a loud voice he abused Dad and Mother and accused them of tramping about all night, and asked if they were elephants. Then he took observations of them and hammered on the wall of his room and called lustily for Jacobs, another lodger, to come and see Esau. The bell rang, and a host of gentlemen boarders with high collars and stiff shirts and soft hands trooped in to breakfast. The lady of the house, stout and stately, sat at the head of the table guarding a dish of sausages.
"So you've got some new lodgers, Mrs. Foley,"
said one, a thin satirical lawyer. The others sniggered. The lady coloured slightly, smiled, and asked Mr. O'Rourke what he would take. "Sausages, I expect," Mr. O'Rourke said, sadly seeing no second dish.
"Sausages for choice," the lawyer added, and there was more sniggering, and fresh colour came into the lady's face.
Doonan bounced in.
"Hello," he exclaimed. "Where's Esau?"
Sweeney spluttered and lost some of his tea. A small, big-footed girl, pouring out tea at a side table, giggled into the cups and scalded herself. The lady rebuked her. "Mary," she said, "Mary, behave." Mary bent forward to place a cup of tea beside the lawyer, and broke out again in his ear and emptied a quantity of the boiling beverage into his lap. He sprang up and said, "Blast it!" and Mary was sent to the kitchen. Then came a noise as if someone was leading horses down the stairs, and Dad and Mother wandered in, looking as though they were afraid of being turned out again.
"Making a start?"
Dad said, pushing Mother to the front and removing his other hat, a broad-leafed felt trimmed with white calico. The gentlemen boarders looked up, then dropped their heads like curlews hiding in the grass, and at intervals stole glances at each other and at Mrs. Foley. Mother showed signs of uneasiness in the presence of so many strangers, and sat on the chair as though she distrusted it. She had no appetite, and would take only a cup of tea. But Dad squared himself and breathed noisily and took sausages every time. Conversation flagged. The rattle of cutlery was the only sound for a good while. until Dad stirred his tea with a knife and started to drink. Then Sweeney, who had no self-control, lost some more of his tea. Mrs. Foley looked distressed, but Doonan, who always knew when to say something, relieved her.
"Was that you walking about early this morning?"
he asked of the lawyer sitting opposite. The lawyer smiled and reached for the jam.
"Where was it?"
Dad joined in,
"Up here?"
pointing his fork, with a sausage impaled on it, at the ceiling. Doonan chuckled and said,
"Yes."
"That were me,"
Dad answered proudly,
"but it weren't early.
turning to Mother.
Weren't it after 4?
Mother said timidly she thought it must have been. "I expect you are used to rising early, Mr. Rudd," said the landlady to Dad.
"Well,"
stowing away the sausage he'd been pointing at the ceiling,
"middlin', Mum. 'Bout 3 mostly. Dave, he gets up first, then Joe and Bill, they gets the cans ready, and Sarah, she sees to the tea for the yard, and—"
The boarder with the mania for music suddenly left the table. "A minute or two to spare," he said, addressing no one in particular, and threw himself down at the piano. The others swallowed their tea hurriedly and left. Dad had another sausage, some more bread, and his 4th cup of tea. Encouraged by the music, or the absence of the boarders, Mother tackled some bread and butter. Dad finished and shifted his chair beside the piano and stared into the face of the musician. The man of music became flustered and struck wrong notes. He wasn't used to being admired.
"What's that the tune of?"
Dad asked. Without shifting his eyes, the other shook his head as though he didn't know.
"What are you playing?"
No response, except a violent conglomeration of sounds. Dad waited till the storm was over, then put the question again. "Alice, where art thou?" the musician hissed, striking a run of discords and poking among the keys for the lost notes.
"Can you play the Wild Colonial Boy on that?"
Dad inquired. "Play the deuce," the musician said savagely, and jumped up and ran away. In the hall he encountered Mrs. Foley. "What is it?" he asked, turning his thumb in the direction of Dad, then went out into the street, working all his fingers in imaginary manipulation of the keyboard. Dad and Mother thought they would mooch about a bit, and strolled into Queen Street. They stood at the Courier corner for half an hour, staring in wonder. The people, the traffic, trams going and trams coming, and the roar and rattle of it all bewildered them. Dad confessed that Brisbane had changed a bit since he knew it 50 years ago. They strained their eyes and ears, trying to absorb everything, and got headaches.
"Look here, look here, look here! 18 lovely apples for 1 shilling, and put 'em in a bag."
Dad felt his pocket. 20 newsboys rushed him, pushing and scrimmaging, shoving their wares into his hands and into his face, and claiming his custom. Mother smiled compassionately on Dad, and they both moved with the throng. A female astride a bike attracted Dad. He grabbed Mother by the arm.
"Look at that one!"
he exclaimed, and both of them stood staring and grinning after the wheeling female until she was lost to them in the traffic. 3 more pedalled past.
"Another!"
Dad gasped, tugging violently at Mother again.
2! 3 of them be damned!
The excitement was too much for Dad. He was compelled to rest. He leaned against a veranda post and reflected on the scene around.
"Never seen the like,"
he said to Mother.
"They're thicker'n wallabies."
And a cheerful growl rumbled from him. They walked Queen Street most of the day and went without lunch. Dad was not a success on the pavement. The city people claimed all the space. They got in his way, pushed him about, collided with him, and whenever he stood a moment to stare back at anything, they carried him off his feet. Dad got sick of it all and took to the street. The street was wider and more in Dad's line. He got on well there, could see everything, and was striding along, his hands locked behind his back, one eye on Mother, the other on some girls hanging out of a window in a top story, when a bus driver yelled, "Hey there! Hey!" and cracked his whip. Dad felt the moist breath of a broken-winded horse on his neck, and had just danced safely to one side when a fat, perspiring female, moving in the same direction on a bike, spurted to pass the bus and drove her front wheel fair between Dad's legs and lifted him up in front of her. Then, like a woman, she let the handles go and screamed, and turned the bicycle over on the wood blocks and mixed Dad up in her skirts. Dad was more bewildered than ever. He didn't know what had attacked him until he regained his feet. Then he scowled on the fallen female, struggling and kicking at the machine like a horse in a fence, and clutching her skirts to hide her great black-stockinged calves, and said,
"One of them damn things,"
and returned to the footpath. Dad joined Mother again, and together they purchased some fruit and explored George Street. Several barristers wearing wigs, their gowns ballooning in the wind, issued from the Supreme Court and swept by. Mother watched them till they were swallowed up in Burnett Lane, then said she supposed they would be bishops. Dad shook his head.
"Might be judges,"
he remarked.
"Ain't bishops, or they'd be in tights."
Assembled at the gates of the courts were a number of legal lights. Among them Dad recognised the lawyer from the boarding-house. Dad was delighted.
"Hello,"
he said.
"This where you are?"
The law resented Dad with a look, but looks were nothing to Dad. The rest of the fraternity smiled and smoked.
"Have some of these,"
Dad said, producing a fistful of bananas from a large brown paper parcel that Mother was hugging. The lawyer frowned.
"No thanks,"
he snapped, turning his back on Dad.
"Put 'em in your pocket,"
said Dad amiably, proceeding to load his reluctant beneficiary with the fruit. Fire flashed from the lawyer's eyes. He drew back fiercely and shouted,
"Go to the devil!"
His learned brethren laughed, and they all moved away, leaving Dad staring perplexedly at Mother. Dad and Mother got tired of the streets and made their way back to the boarding-house. Dad took the lead and found Wickham Terrace without any trouble. Dad was a good bushman. The bump of locality was strong in Dad. Then he stalked into a private dwelling courageously, dragging Mother after him, wandered among the furniture looking for the stairs, and alarmed the inmates. A man with a capacious stomach hanging to him like a staghorn and wearing glasses came and saw them both off the premises again, and remained on the steps till they closed the gate and departed. Mother remonstrated with Dad in the street for being a stupid.
"I could have sworn that were it,"
Dad said, staring back at the place. Then, after eyeing a house a few doors up,
"Ah, this is the one."
He placed his hand on the gate and opened it eagerly. Mother hesitated. She wasn't going to follow Dad any more. She wasn't quite sure of him. Dad chuckled.
"You're bushed,"
he said, mounting the steps heavily and striding in at the open door. Inside, Dad saw himself revealed in a large mirror and was confused. He stood staring and trying to remember the surroundings. "Well?" from a sonorous voice in a corner of the room. Dad glanced around and saw another fat man with glasses on, looking hard at him from behind a book.
"Ain't this Mrs. Brown's boarding-house?"
Dad asked.
"3 doors up," the voice said.
"Damn it," Dad said, and rushed out. Finally, Mother recognised Mary grinning from a balcony. Then Dad knew the place and rejoiced. They wandered in and mounted the stairs and found their room. Dad said he would have a wash. He threw off his coat and shirt and splashed and bubbled noisily in a basin and made a great mess of the wall and the floor. When he dried himself, he pulled his boots off and, like a horse that's been ploughing or ridden hard all day, rolled heavily on the bed and groaned. He had scarcely stretched himself when Mrs. Foley, pale and looking as though she'd seen a ghost or buried a boarder, appeared at the door of the room and asked Dad if he'd thrown any water over the balcony.
"No,"
Dad answered, sitting up.
"Only what I just washed myself in."
"Good gracious me!" Mrs. Brown exclaimed, putting her palms together. Then it went all over a lady and gentleman passing in the street.
"It did?"
Dad said, jumping up and going to the balcony for verification. Below he saw a tall swell holding a wet silk hat in one hand, while with a handkerchief in the other he mopped splashes from the skirts of a gorgeous female. At intervals the swell glared wickedly at the walls of the house and made threatening remarks.
What?
Dad called out apologetically.
Did that go on you?
The swell looked up.
Was it you who threw that water, fella?
Dad turned to the room, snatched up the towel he'd dried himself in, and rolled it into a lump.
Here,
He shouted, hanging over the balcony again.
wipe her with that.
And he threw the towel down. It opened in its flight like a fan and spread itself over the swell's head and shoulders and blindfolded him.
Blackguard!
The swell cried, dragging the moist rag from his head.
Damn your insolence!
And he looked up fiercely.
John!
The lady interposed. Don't get exasperated, my dear.
Damn!
John! Then they moved away and left Dad staring from the balcony. End of section 3. Recording by Son of the Exiles. Section 4 of Dad's Trip to Brisbane by Steele Rudd. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Son of the Exiles. Section 4. Seeing the City. Next day, Saturday, Dad and Mother were out early enough to gather mushrooms. They wandered through the streets again for hours and finally found their way to the museum. At first they saw only collections of stones and a lot of bones and things, and Dad felt disappointed and was loudly condemning the institution when they happened on a family of dingoes and a number of kangaroos and an eagle-hawk standing tragically on the neck of a cowering old bear. Dad opened his eyes. He guffawed excitedly and looked from one to the other. Dad could have slept in the museum then. He could have died happily there. He spoke cheerfully to the kangaroos, hooted the dingo, looked down with a grin on the form of the native bear, and said,
Well, I'm damned.
Dad was always glad to meet anyone from the bush. A man came along, a man with long, ragged coat sleeves and boots with hardly any heels or soles to them, a man who trembled as though he were addicted to eating indigo, and stood beside Dad and looked at the kangaroos too. Dad told him the sort they were, and explained how high they could jump, and showed him the toe they ripped dogs with.
And which one do they rip men with?
The man asked in a harsh, unsympathetic voice.
Oh, same one,
Dad answered.
Oh, they do?
The man shrieked.
I thought perhaps they stung 'em with their tails.
Dad laughed merrily.
You're thinking of death adders,
He broke out.
They stings with the tail.
Same as bears?
And the man made an effort to button his coat, but there were no buttons on it. Dad laughed more.
Bears?
He yelled in an amused tone,
I haven't got a tail. Here's a bear.
turning and pointing to the one the hawk was standing guard over.
No tail, see?
But the man didn't pay any attention to Dad. He pointed triumphantly to the dingo and asked,
Hasn't that one got a tail?
The laugh Dad made went all over the museum.
That's not a bear, man.
He cried when he got his breath.
That's a dingo, a native dog.
An ancient official came along and asked Dad to be quiet.
Or you'll frighten the kangaroos.
The ragged man added, turning his back and slinking away a step.
Well, that chap,
Dad chuckled,
calls this,
lifting his big boot and placing it against the glass case and indicating the dingo.
a bear.
The official smiled and disappeared. Dad laughed some more to himself. Then the man returned and, stepping up to Dad, motioned him with his head as though he wished to confide something to him. Dad ceased laughing and bent down and placed his ear close to the man's mouth. The man spoke in a low, reverent tone. He said,
Have you a bob about you?
Dad had. Then the man glided out like a ghost and disappeared too. Dad and Mother struck the boarding house for dinner. At the table, Dad led the conversation. He spoke enthusiastically of the roos and dingoes in the museum, and, waving his fork with a potato on it, advised everyone to go and see them.
"You'd split yourself laughing,"
he said, addressing the boarding-house keeper,
"to see the old men sitting there as if they was up in the bloomin' bush."
"What about the young one?" Mother chirped, smiling shyly.
"Ah, I forgot."
And Dad chewed hurriedly.
"Yeah, and they've got a big she standing up there staring at you."
Dad threw back his head, opened his eyes and mouth, and displayed a lot of chewed meat, and made himself wild-looking.
"And a big lump of a joey hanging out of her pouch, and cocking its head all round the place as cunning as you like."
Most of the boarders burst out laughing. The lady of the house smiled, then got red in the face, and smiled again when the lawyer asked Dad whether kangaroos were better to eat than bears. But a young lady, a school-teacher, sitting opposite Dad, asked to be excused, and bounced away from the table, leaving her dinner almost untouched. A dead silence followed. The lawyer grinned at O'Rourke.
"She don't eat much,"
Dad said, following the teacher with his eyes.
"If she had nothing but kangaroo for a while, she'd eat more than that."
The boarders roared some more, and when they left the table they collected in Jacob's room and yelled again, and the lawyer said Dad was worth a quid. Afternoon. Mother rested herself, and Dad stalked out alone. He found Queen Street almost empty. The crowds of chattering, jawing females flaunting their frills and furbelows were gone, thank God. And the blokes with their sticks hanging to their arms and their Panamas pushed up behind. And the contented-looking aldermen with their ponderous stomachs, and the politicians arguing at corners and waving umbrellas and folded newspapers about, and the long-coated divine tapping a book with his lean forefinger and interpreting Solomon to an anxious disciple, and the wild-looking, unshorn man about town with the long stride and heavy boots, and the rowing men flying their colours in their coats and talking clean blades and dirty oars and getting your hands away, and the swaggering footballers with coloured handkerchiefs thrown about their necks, and the toffs and the dudes and the johnnies and the straw hat push. All were gone. Dad stood on the curbing and gazed down the almost deserted street. A bus drawn by 4 stiff, starved-looking horses, laden with footballers in caps and overcoats, went by. The footballers hung out of the bus and waved a flag and clamoured and called derisively to Dad. Dad smiled. Pum, pum, pum. Dad jumped around and stared up the street. A brass band burst violently upon the air. It blared out Men of Harlech. Behind it a regiment of foot volunteers, armed with rifles and water bags and haversacks and helmets, marched fearlessly. They were a dashing lot of chaps, brave, formidable-looking fellows too, a grand galaxy. Some were tall as gum trees, some just beginning to sprout, some old and hoary and humpbacked, some all stomach and head, others all helmet and no head or stomach at all, one without a uniform, one with 2 rifles, one with an eyeglass, and one dead lame, but he managed to keep up. As the band approached him, belching music out of itself, Dad began to prance like an old horse. Dad had been a soldier himself. He nearly went to the Crimea, so he said. He often regretted not having gone too. Sometimes we regretted too. Just opposite Dad, the officer in command, a heavily medalled person, sitting cautiously astride a well-polished horse, lifted his voice and yelled, "Shoulder! And shoulder arms was yelled all along the line. Those who had been in engagements before manoeuvred their rifles calmly. Others dropped them in the street and excitedly groped for them again and brought trouble and confusion to the ranks. Dad was carried away with enthusiasm. He stepped from the pavement and joined the volunteers. He walked beside the band, carrying his hat in his hand. The volunteers marched down George Street and entered the Botanic Gardens. A crowd, composed mostly of girls and old women and noisy, ragged youngsters of the street, followed. In the gardens there was great excitement. A lot of big guns were there mounted on wheels, all pointing steadily at the people on Kangaroo Point. And talk about soldiers! Talk about Aldershot or the handful of men Bonaparte dropped returning from Moscow! The grounds were swarming with them. They were moving in all directions, marching in file, in line, in groups, and marching right at each other. And the generals and majors and sergeant majors and adjutants and lieutenant colonels that were there. You'd wonder how they all found uniforms. The generals careered round on horseback, flopping and bumping about in the saddle and shouting orders. They were all in authority. Some yelled,
"Left battalion!"
at one end of the field, another,
"Company leaders!"
at the other end. Several others,
"Second division, right incline! Forward! Halt! Dress up!
several score others,
Right! Well!"
and all at the same time. 'Twas a stirring scene, a memorable sight. Dad reckoned he would never forget it. Finally the forces combined and formed a huge square, 2 deep. They prepared to fire a feu de joie. The majors and colonels and all the rest galloped about inside the square. You'd think word had just been received of an invasion. After numerous warnings and words of advice from different officers, the order was given to
"Present!"
Every rifle in the lines was instantly pointed at the clouds, except about half a dozen in the rear ranks. They were unconsciously levelled at the head of the man in front. Several youthful warriors, when their fingers felt the triggers, trembled with excitement, and one let his rifle go off before it was time, and made a gorgeous officer swear and the spectators laugh.
"Fire!"
Was the next order, and the rifles went off like a lot of crackers, bang, 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 all along the line. Some of the horses reared, several officers fell out of their saddles. A man in the front rank reeled about and fell down. The man behind had shot him in the ear, blowing it all away and blackening his neck and jaw with powder. 2 others grew confused and couldn't pull the triggers at all, but they persisted and got their weapons to go off when the rest had finished firing. The wounded soldier was taken away by the ambulance, and Dad followed
to see what they were going to do to him.
The forms of Dad and Mother became familiar to residents of Wickham Terrace. When they were passing, people used to stare out at them and grin, and some would run out and lean over the garden fence and watch them going along. With the boys round there too, Dad became a great favourite. They used to call him Ironbark, and advise him to get his hair cut, and often they would follow him along and aim orange peel at him till he turned and glared. Then they would pretend to be frightened and skedaddle. One evening at dusk, Dad and Mother, after spending an enjoyable day in Queen Street, were mooching along the terrace, making for the boarding house. Dad was carrying a pair of glass vases Mother had purchased for Sarah, and was wondering how Dave and Joe were getting along at home. Mother had a new umbrella in one hand and a brown paper parcel in the other. Suddenly a snake wriggled across the footpath, almost from under their feet. Dad got a great start. He jumped back, tugging Mother with him.
"A snake!"
he said in a surprised tone. Mother clutched Dad's arm. But Dad never allowed a snake to escape him. He looked round for something to attack it with. Nothing was handy. Several men and a girl on a veranda nearby watched interestedly. Dad placed his hand on a white fence and tried to move some of it, but all the palings were firmly nailed. The snake glided slowly along. There was no time to lose. Dad snatched Mother's new umbrella from her hand and pounced on the reptile. The snake didn't take any notice of the blows Dad rained on it. It headed leisurely for the other side of the street, where there was some long grass and a park inside a fence. Dad jumped after it and walloped it all the way across, and smashed the umbrella into a lot of pieces, and didn't hear the roar that came from the men on the veranda. The snake reached the grass, and as it disappeared, Dad heaved the vases at it, which made a great crash. Then a lot of small boys jumped up and fled with the snake on a string. Dad stared after them. They looked around but kept running.
"Well, I'm damned,"
Dad said, turning to Mother. End of section 4. Recording by Son of the Exiles. Section 5 of Dad's Trip to Brisbane. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Son of the Exiles. Dad's Trip to Brisbane by Steele Rudd. Section 5. The Return Home. Dad and Mother tramped about Brisbane for 3 weeks, and but for meeting old Delaney, dodging through the crowd one evening, they might have been strolling about there yet. Dad and old Delaney were enemies at home, but when they met in Queen Street, they gripped hands and rejoiced as though they were never to part any more. Dad laughed and said he didn't know Delaney was down, and inquired where he was staying.
"And how are them boys of mine doing?"
he asked. "Doing splendid," Delaney said. Dad was pleased. "They gave great races in your paddock a week come Wednesday." Dad stared and struggled for breath. "And they're to give a ball tomorrow."
"What?"
Dad shouted, opening wide his mouth and attracting much notice.
"What?"
Next minute Dad was stumping up Edward Street in advance of Mother, who was compelled to trot to keep in sight. The Great Metropolis had no more charms for Dad. At 9 o'clock the following night, Dad and Mother arrived at Saddletop. Gray's cart happened to be at the station, and they were given a lift to the gate. Mother thanked the man and gave him a banana, but Dad was thinking heavily. Sounds of music floated on the peaceful air and provoked Dad to profanity. He threw wide the big white gate, leaving Mother to close it. Dogs barked and bounded down the track, at first threatening to eat Dad, but then, recognising him, jumped for joy and climbed and clawed all over him, heedless of kicks and curses. Dad expressed no pleasure at seeing the house again. You would never think he'd been away at all. A large area of newly ploughed land discernible in the moonlight, and a number of fresh lucerne stacks that changed the whole aspect of Ruddville, failed to attract his eye. He noticed nothing till he came to a long line of saddle horses fastened to the fence. One had its nose in a bit of hay. Dad spotted that horse, and, like a plain turkey taking wing, threw out his arms and rushed onto the verandah. Inside, the Prince of Wales schottische had just ended, and the perspiring party stood round the ballroom, ablaze with candles, listening attentively to the voices of Miss Todd and the schoolmaster's wife blending pathetically in song together. "After the ball is over," they were screeching, just when Dad burst into the room.
"What the devil's this?" he
bellowed. They stopped like a clock.
"Who brought all of you into my house?"
Consternation.
"Out of here! Out of this! The whole damn lot of you!"
"Dad!" Sarah gasped, her voice scarcely audible. Dad's enraged eye rested on the trembling form of Billy Berrup by his side. Such a howl! A brown paper parcel he held in his hand, containing a pair of heavy boots, flew at Berrup's head and struck big Mrs. McManus on the chest. Commotion, screams, and a wild rush to escape. In the stampede Berrup was left behind, and while the little fellow frantically fought and sparred for an opening, Dad kicked at him as if he were a wallaby fast in a fence.
"Stop it!"
Dave cried angrily.
"Don't make a fool of—"
But Dad silenced Dave.
"Clear out!"
he roared.
"Leave my house!"
Dave was inclined to resist.
"Leave the place or I'll send for the police!"
Dad yelled in a wild, broken voice.
"Pshaw!"
Dave hissed and walked out. The ejected guests secured their horses in haste and left in disorder. Sarah and Dave and Joe, bareheaded, stood in the yard and silently stared after them. The last one passed out and the gate closed. Voices and hoofbeats died away. The neighs of a horse and the hoop-hoop of a night bird came from the ironbark ridge.
"Robbed! Ruined!"
from the house. The clock struck 2.
Ruining me! Ruining me!
from the house again. Mopoke, mopoke, from out the gully on the reserve. The clock struck 3. The moon ceased to shine and Dad to shout. Sarah dried her eyes and stole quietly to her room.
"Oh, well," Dave said, "let it rip."
And he and Joe turned to the barn and camped with the men. End of Dad's Trip to Brisbane by Steele Rudd. Recording by Son of the Exiles.